Hey everyone, and welcome to my Procreate demo for the piece I call Blade Journey. So this one started off, I didn't really know what I was going to try and build from the get-go, to be honest. I just sort of had a very loose idea of a woman in a big cloak. That was really it. After the last series of videos actually, where I was doing my more in-depth tutorial, I wanted to just sort of get back to basics for this one. Actually, the day I released those 5 videos was the day that Procreate released its really big update. So I wanted to be able to do one that used the screen capture, so I actually captured the first 90 minutes or so of this piece, but then unfortunately Procreate did not save out the video. So I was left with a 2-minute black screen, which was a bit of a bummer, but luckily the most of the time lapse did not go away. So that's what we've got here. What you're seeing early in this video is me just trying to find what it is I want to draw. Like I said, I knew I wanted like this solitary woman in a cloak, but I had no idea where it was going to go from there. I had this idea then for this fur coat and all this, but something I recognized pretty quickly here, as you can see me adjusting it, and you'll see me do a lot of adjusting and a lot of drawing over the roughs again and all that, is that I wanted to do something where my head to body proportions was different than what I normally do. I wanted to do something where she had a relatively large body, or at the very least that her armor and her cloak and her cowl and I guess a hood, you know, the big furry collar, that all of that was really big compared to her. So either big body or big armor, or maybe by drawing big body I get to big armor, like that type of thing. That's what I really wanted to go for, because I normally do a different head ratio to body. So anyways, that's where we are to here now. And you can see I added these big pauldrons on her, and I hated them. I knew I needed something going on there, but I didn't know what it was. So now this is where I said, okay, I've got this rough idea. Let me lower the opacity on those lines and then build in her body. So I start building in just what her core body might look like underneath all of that. I also didn't want to do anything with her hands where her hands were going to be interacting with anything. At one point I was going to put a staff in her hand, and I was like, nah, that's so played out and cheesy. So I just sort of wanted her standing there stoically, very similar to the monk that I did, because I sort of, when I was going into this, I was like, I wonder if those two can be tied together in some way, or at least exist in the same universe. So that was my thought process going into this. So you can see at this point I come up with this sort of like insanely exaggerated, almost epaulette looking thing, and from there I say, okay, well, I kind of like this enough to really get going. So now you've seen a couple of layers of roughs going on, and now here's the I guess you could say the third or fourth set of roughs. I sort of did that first initial one with the big ass pauldrons, then did the rough for the body to try and get the body type down, then I did the rough where you see these pauldrons get added on, these new pauldrons getting added on, these exaggerated epaulettes, and then you see this rough where I'm going in and starting to figure out what she actually looks like. So there were a couple of smaller things that I did throughout this that were maybe atypical for me. Usually I do a slightly more cartoony face, or certain proportions get pushed differently than I did here. I'm not gonna say that this was like a reinvention of what I normally do, but there were just a couple of little choices in there that I think tweaked it up a little bit. You can see also her eyes here have like a little bit of this sort of smoky, not smoky like makeup term smoky eye, but just more of this like, it's a different eye than I normally do. It's a less bubbly eye, but to be honest, after I did it, even though I like it, it really wasn't what I was going for. So you'll see in the final version, I open up that eye a little bit more because I wanted it to have like this sort of generally serious vibe, but I didn't want to lose anything that was sort of stylistically cartoonish. In that last bit, you saw me add the block in for that sword really fast, the really big sword she has on her back. So now here I am going in. I wanted to give you some tight shots of what happened in the face. This is me just going in and starting to put down what would hopefully be the final lines for the face. People ask about the brushes. in my last set of videos where I detailed a lot of my process. This is just my fat pencil, my good trusty fat pencil. That's what I use to, people ask me on like Instagram, what do you use to ink? I wouldn't necessarily say this is like an ink. It's just a very tight line, I guess you could say. And you can really see like in the texture of the pencil too, like if this piece were printed at actual size, you'd be able to see all that texture. It's just when it gets posted on something like Instagram, everything looks like a really tight little clean line, but in reality it's a type of pencil here. So now I'm just going through and really just sort of mechanically, in a way, executing on my rough sketch. I knew the look that the head was going to have, because the sketch was actually pretty clean as far as that goes. Now with the actual fur here, this is where I made the decision to go for this sort of dark fur that has these lighter tips at the end. This was all, again, done with the fat pencil. I did all the line art in this with the fat pencil. I just boosted the size a little bit and embraced some of the penciliness of it in order to pull this off. So just going through and doing a lot of short strokes, trying to mimic the movement of that fur. And then when there's a spot where the light tips are, I just made sure to try and pack in some darkness right behind it so that it would push that forward a little bit. Rewatching this, I'm realizing we were watching Die Hard when I drew this. Not the most inspiring thing to watch when you're trying to do a fantasy piece, but it was it was good to zone out to a movie that I've seen a million times while I was doing this type of fur stuff. So you can see here that I could have gone a little bit more natural with this and just put in all of the fur without doing that stylized line treatment ahead of time, but really that's what I wanted. It was a deliberate attempt to try and find that merging that you look for of real and not real, or stylized, just because I didn't want it to be so naturalistic that it didn't click with the rest of the piece. So now I'm just going in and I'm continuing to finish off this fur. And you can see here by the way that got decreased in opacity that's all on its own layer right there. And then I'm carving out where the hair goes and now putting the hair back in. So here now I'm going in and putting in her sort of clasp that holds everything together. I did it by doing a circle brush and then warping it and then going in and trying to do a naturalistic line, but as you can see there, I made a note of I just didn't like it, so I redid it and made it much cleaner and added just a little bit of damage to it so that it looked like more of a pencil-y line. I just wasn't feeling drawing circles that night, I guess. And then here I went in and I did a flat version of the dagger that goes in that clasp so that I could then warp it and duplicate it and establish that depth that you see on that little like embossed symbol. So now I'm going in and doing standard fantasy ribbing on the epaulette, I guess. We will call them epaulettes regardless of how accurate that is to their description for the rest of this thing. I sort of imagine that the top of those epaulettes had like some sort of really dark material, not necessarily that it was stone, but that it was some sort of weird, darkish, chiseled type thing. And then it has this ribbing on it with these maybe leather panels hanging down that have gems in them. And then like those ropes hanging down, I was just imagining some sort of a really heavy duty, almost like cord that's like a rope that maybe is used to cinch up everything that she's got on around her. And now I'm just going in and putting in some damage into those. I really didn't go in with all that much organization when I was designing these things hanging down, so they're not perfectly uniform. I don't know if that's good or bad. I mean, I could always justify it and say maybe whoever made it didn't make them perfectly uniform on purpose, but we all know that like she looks like she's a pretty important person, so she would probably have pretty awesome stuff, and it would probably all be really, really well made, and then just later battle worn, but I was being lazy. So now I'm going in and adding in the gems that are sort of on there, and then the again, enhancing the damage and making sure that my outlines are good. You can see right there, if you go back, there's just little flicks in the fur. It's that thing when you're working on any piece where suddenly your eye catches something and you're like, oh shit, I should have made that better, and you go back in and do it real quick. So now we're doing the ribbing on the opposite epaulette. Sometimes I decide to not zoom in on these videos because even though some of you may be watching it on your phone or watching it on some sort of a screen that's not ideal, I do post these videos at 1080p. So hopefully you should be able to get the screen big enough or the video big enough so you can see it. So here I tried to apply some organization. You can see there I had a bunch of horizontal lines on a different layer. I was using that to line up the parts that were hanging, the I guess panels that are hanging down. I was trying to line those up with the ones on the other side so that they were at least somewhat accurate to each other, even if they weren't the most uniform thing ever. So now we're going in and adding the damage on that side. You know, this is actually something I was recently talking about with some friends regarding the Final Fantasy universe, because I'm playing through Final Fantasy 15 right now. My biggest problem right now with what Square does with their universes is that they just feel too clean. I think that they did a really good job in the new game with all their little outposts and everything. Those feel like dirty and like worn, but you know, the main characters and everything that they have, I mean, I know he's a prince, but just everything feels super clean. I was talking about games like Final Fantasy VII and some of the other entries like in the Tactics series and stuff. They all felt like they were damaged, and I feel like this is all just a really long way to say that like adding wear and tear to your world is really good to add a tactile nature to it, even if you're dealing with something that might be maybe on the pristine side. You know, even if you I know it's a modern reference, but if you buy something brand new today, unless it's like an Apple product or something where they're like really focused on how clean that form is going to be, you're going to get all these little imperfections. Even if it's something where you have to turn it in the light just right to see it, you're going to get imperfections. I think that's just really important in design, to make sure that you're making the thing that you're designing, you're making sure that it looks lived in and like it exists. And especially on a character like this, who seems like she's this badass warrior type. You know, she's gonna, even the most badass warriors get grazed every now and then, or something just goes wrong, or they get, you know, double crossed or something. And so even if you design the most badass character that can handle themselves, like, they're going to end up encountering some sort of damage. So, you know, if your world is really pristine, you're usually saying that your world is like really futuristic and modern and everything's perfect and all that kind of stuff. At least that's how it's like interpreted. So with something like this, I really wanted to make sure that all that damage was accounted for. So while I've been rambling about that, I've been filling in her entire body, just putting in lots of layers. I wanted underneath that cloak to have a lot of depth, so I wanted to make sure that she had like armor upon armor upon armor, and these layers of clothing with like this sort of tabard type thing, and then the bag and the belt and the pouch and all of that shit. So here now, I've turned all of her lines off, and I'm just working on the sword now. This was a decision, you know, I think that everybody loves the idea of like this person who's just sort of stoically walking, and they've got like this big ass weapon on their back. It's that thing of, you know, walk softly and carry a big stick. It's sort of the same general idea. It's like this person who's just not saying much, and they don't have, they're not very boisterous, they're not very forthcoming, and then they've got this big ass weapon on their back. I just think that's always really cool. And she seemed like a good candidate for that type of a story, so to speak. So I thought it'd be cool to say that, yeah, she's part of that monk story, and her part of that story is just called Blade Journey. And, you know, maybe I mentioned on Instagram that she needed a good name because she seems like she's some sort of a hard ass. I'd like to think that she's, you know, everybody's got names for her, the Deathbringer, the blah blah blah, and all that kind of shit. So these are the types of things that I like to come up with whenever I'm doing any kind of piece, because even if it's not particularly great storytelling or it's not particularly deep, it at least gives me more that I can sort of base everything on when I'm working on something. So if I were to go on to do, you know, pose sheets of her, or do some sort of like if she were from a video game, do like a move sheet where it's like, oh yeah, here's her doing this attack and doing that attack. These are the types of things that I would really want to know, because I'd want to be able to design her and her moves in a way that sort of speaks to that. So now we've moved into the coloring phase. So this is going to come as a surprise. I used a different brush this time. I thought it'd be fun. When I was working on the crow piece that I did, there was a point before I put the shadows in where I was like, oh, this is kind of cool, just leaving it like this. And so I wanted to do something like that for this. I wanted to do something where I was deliberately setting out to do that before I got excited about the idea of doing shadows. So I just sort of made that decision right away. And then I used the brush in the painting section of Procreate that's called Damp Brush. Damp brush. That's the brush I used. And I didn't tweak it at all. I just used it. And the thing I liked about it was that it pulls the paint from underneath and it smears it, and it's really messy. And so it was going to force me to be messy, because I find that I'm overly clean. I'm just too focused on trying to keep certain things clean. So by giving myself a tool like that, it sort of tricks me into having to be messier. So to catch up on the video now, I've changed the lines to a little bit of like a light purple and set them to multiply, and then I went in with the damp brush and I started filling everything in. You've got a light skin tone, and then you've got a slightly darker gradient just coming up from her neck. We've got the blush layer per usual. We've got a little bit of an eyeshadow layer per usual, and lip layer per usual. So all that is built in layers exactly how I normally would. It's just I'm using the damp brush to do it. And then with the big mane of fur from her hood collar thing, I went in with a lighter color at first and then color slid it to be darker. Now I'm going back in with a lighter color, and I'm just making sure that those tips stand out a little bit more. So here too, I had no idea what I wanted for the color palette for her when I first went into it. I just knew that in general I sort of wanted the whole thing to be on the warm side. I wanted her to sort of be in a cold environment, but I wanted the piece to feel warm, which is, I know that isn't like the greatest idea. I don't really know why I decided to do that exactly. But I think that in the end what comes off is that she's in a cold environment, but that it's just a slightly aged image. So I think that works. So here I am now just going in. The gems themselves are actually the ones that have the most layers if you were to divide this into individual things, just because I want to make sure I caught some of the overhang from the upper epaulets. So now I'm just going through and I'm adding in that, like, the darkening and the emboss on her badge, coloring in, or not badge, her clasp, and then I'm adding in the ropes. I mean, this is all really straightforward. All I'm doing is sort of choosing the color that I think is going to work the best, and then with the damp brush going in and painting. So here's an interesting trick. So first I just painted her whole body one color, and then I went in on a separate layer, just one layer, and I put in all the other colors really messy that I think that her outfit would have, and then I lowered the opacity of that whole layer so that it would absorb everything from behind it. So that's why you see on her body it looks kind of dark and dim, but there's still some color there. That's basically how I did that part. Okay, so now I'm going through and just basically finishing the colors. Now I did duplicate the background and then lowered the opacity and put all of that over the sword layer, because the lines and flats for the sword are on their own layer. In their own folder actually. Now here I'm just adding in a bunch of last minute tweaks, a lot of color adjustments, and then I add this rim around the entire form, which is what just got plugged in there. Some extra knockback, and then some last minute tweaks. And this right here is the final piece. But what I did was I then went back in later and I tried to redo a screen capture, and that's what we have here. So I wanted to just sort of walk you through the way my layers and everything are set up. So you can see here with the new system I have folders, because layer groups are awesome. So we've got a color adjustment on top. There's a folder I just opened that is the main lines, so you can see her breath is on top of that, and then there's the eye glints. I'm renaming the breath right now because I forgot to name that layer. Then color lines, and then the old lines, I just keep those around so that I make sure I have them. And then here's all the flats now for her her just main form minus the sword. This is everything. You can see I've got the name skin, but then on something like gems, then I've just got 1, 2, 3 above it, because that's just the tweaks that go above that. There's the outline layer. So this is the main line, or excuse me, main lines and flats folders. Then here's the outline that I just added on, so you can see it. It's just behind her, basically, on a layer. So it's behind her, but on top of the sword, you can see there. Then you see that knockback layer. That's the background has been duplicated into its own layer. You see me moving it around a little bit there. That is over the sword. So that's my attempt at knocking that sword back so that it falls back in atmosphere and it falls back in importance. So here I'm turning up to 100%, so you can see that it's basically just a duplicate of the background. And then there's my sword lines, the color lines, and then I have a fade layer just because I erased away some of it so that I could get some more of that knockback going on. And then the sword flats actually were all separate layers at one point, but then I merged them into one for various reasons, and then like layer limitation reasons. And then I had a damage layer on top that just sort of accented some of the damage. It was like a 25% black. Yeah, that's all that is. So all those undos you see me doing is just making sure that I didn't screw up the percentages that I had before. So the next section is talking about, like, we're going to turn some of this stuff off. So there's the color adjustment layer off, so you can see how dramatically that affects everything. The white damage stuff to the piece, I just turned that off. I just turned off the texture. Now you can, I'm going to zoom in here, you can see what the texture does for it. So now we'll turn that watercolor paper texture back on, and there you go. You can see how dramatic that is. Again, on something like Instagram, it doesn't really show up, but when you view this piece somewhere else, you're really going to notice that. And that's just set to multiply with its opacity lowered a bit, just for the record there. These are probably all going to be things that will end up in a future video, because every time I do a video about tips and tricks, or I think about it, I forget half the things that I want to talk about. So now we're going to check out that color layer that I used to adjust the entire thing. So you can see here, it's just basically set to color. I know it's named color, but it's also set to color with its opacity lowered quite a bit. When you crank up the opacity, you can see this is what happens. It obviously slowly changes all the colors. This is what happens if you flip it to hue, which is a pretty cool look if you want to try and replicate like a marker look or something like that. Obviously in post-processing, as opposed to just doing it in the program to make it look like marker. This is what it looks like with color. So you can see with color, it's a little bit richer. It keeps more of the vibrancy of the overall piece. And so this is what I ended up doing in order to tweak all the color for the entire thing. Pretty straightforward solution. If you were to flip it to oh yeah, also just so you can see what the core color of this thing is, like this is what the color is. It's just sort of like this orangey peachy thing. The way I originally did it was I just sort of put it in as like a yellow, adjusted it to what I felt like was the right amount of effect for the piece, and then color slid it using hue saturation in order to try and find. So here you can see, if I were to switch it to different things, you can get a lot of different vibes off of it. You go to green and things start feeling a little bit maybe eerie. You go bluer, things start getting a little bit colder or maybe darker. It starts feeling like nighttime, something like that. But this is the color that I was going with. So let's turn that off for a second and look at white damage. This is something that I've actually talked about in previous pieces, but I've never really shown. So here you can see I have this layer on top that's called white damage, and it's adding all this noise and all of the, damage really to the piece. Although it sort of replicates a bit of like a snowy feel or a frosty feel, it's also damage, so it's like an abstraction of that feeling. So it's set to screen. Now here I've turned it all the way up to 100% opacity. You can see what that looks like, and now I've flipped off screen. This is the image, so to speak, that I'm using here. If you flip it to multiply, this is what it looks like. As I explained in the last video, Multiply makes anything closer to white start going towards transparency, and screen does the opposite. So since we want the white to be the part that's present, we use screen, because then that makes the black go transparent. If you flipped it to say an overlay, this is what it would look like. This is just a recap, just some of the look that we talked about in the previous set of videos. So screen is what we're going for though for this piece, because we wanted the black to disappear. Now, how did I even get that image in the first place? How did I get that sort of core texture that I'm working with? Well, first what I do is I bring in a image of a sort of damaged paper, and then I start tweaking it. So now here we'll bring in that paper. Now here is the paper that created that later distortion, I guess. So you can see here I just size it up to cover the entire thing. I'm a little haphazard with it. Luckily it really worked out, but I could have ended up having to work with it for a really long time. In Procreate you can do this, which is pretty cool. You can desaturate the whole image, so desaturate that layer. So just go into your hue, saturation, brightness, and turn your saturation all the way down. Then go into curves and start adjusting your curves in order to get a much more intense image. Now I'm not going to bother explaining it right now, but you can mess around with this curve and you can see all the different things that you can do. Personally, because I don't do a lot of fine tuning, I actually prefer in Photoshop just having contrast and brightness, because I never really need the control that curves gives you. As you can see here, I'm monkeying around with it so you can see all that stuff. But what I'm really looking for is to make this as intense as possible. So I make as intense as possible while still maintaining some degree of a mid-range. So that's what I ended up going with right there. I go back into hue, saturation, brightness, and I lighten it just a little bit so that I can take some of that intensity out of it. And by doing that, I can increase the amount of white that's currently on screen. Now I'll go back into the curves. This is all just me being really tweaky, so none of this is like the core trick yet. This is more just how to get to that really high contrast base texture you're going to use. Now, here's the main trick to the whole thing. Oh, first I'm going to show you. So like if I go into my layer settings and I open it up and I go like, I flip this to screen, as you can see, all the black fades away and we've got this big mess of white in the center. If I switch to multiply, it's the opposite. But this isn't what we're going for, right? We're not going for a dark damage, we're going for a white damage or a light damage. So I need to invert this. The best way to do that in Procreate is with curves. If you take your line that you start with when it first opens up and you make it go from bottom left to top right and you change that to top left to bottom right, it inverts the image. You could do this with anything, but on here it's really great so that you can see, look at that. Now we've got white in the damagey areas around the edges, and we've got black in the middle. So what that ends up giving us is when you set it to screen, you can do this cool trick. If you were going for a dark damage, you would just leave it the way it was and set it to multiply or something. So that's going to be it for this piece, guys. I hope there were enough little tricks in here that were cool, and I hope watching the piece in general was really fun. And otherwise, I really just hope you enjoyed watching. So thanks for watching. Please consider liking and subscribing. And if you're looking for me on the internet, these are the places where you can find me.